The air inside the Grand Hall of the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa was thick with anticipation. Leaders from across the continent had gathered, each wearing the weight of history on their shoulders. Cameras flashed, translators prepared their headsets, and security stood rigid along the walls. But the tension in the room came not from protocol or ceremony, it came from the presence of two men whose clash had become inevitable. Benjamin Netanyahu had arrived with the sharp confidence of a man accustomed to command. His eyes scanned the room, calculating, projecting authority. He knew his words would echo beyond this chamber, reaching allies and adversaries alike. His aides whispered in his ear, handing him carefully drafted talking points. Across from him sat Ibrahim Traoré, the young and unyielding leader of Burkina Faso. Unlike most, Traoré had no interest in appeasing Western powers. His presence was calm but unmovable, like stone against the wind. Around him, African leaders leaned closer, curious to see if this young captain would again defy a figure as entrenched as Netanyahu. When Netanyahu stood, silence fell. His voice carried the polished weight of years in diplomacy. War is inevitable, he declared, his tone both warning and threat. Your nations align with forces that destabilize, and history will show that resistance against us ends in ruin. His gaze locked on Traoré, as if the entire continent's defiance had a single face. Murmurs rippled through the room. Some leaders shifted uncomfortably, others looked down at their notes. Netanyahu's words were not just a warning, they were a challenge, meant to instill fear. But Traoré did not flinch. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his military jacket catching the bright lights of the hall. His expression was controlled, steady, but his eyes burned with conviction. And when he spoke, the room froze. Then face Africa's fire. His words cut through the silence like thunder. He did not raise his voice, yet every syllable carried power. We will not bow. We will not surrender. If war is what you demand, then know this, Africa is not afraid. The hall erupted, some in gasps, others in applause. What had begun as a diplomatic summit had transformed into a battlefield of words. The first shot had been fired, not with weapons, but with will. The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Then face Africa's fire. It was more than a reply, it was defiance, a declaration that echoed across the marble walls of the summit hall. Netanyahu's lips tightened. He had faced adversaries before, but rarely had anyone so young, so unapologetic, dared to meet his threat head-on. His aides leaned forward, whispering urgently, trying to draft his counterstrike. But Netanyahu raised his hand, silencing them. His pride would not allow retreat. Around the hall, reactions split like cracks in dry earth. Some Western diplomats shifted uncomfortably in their seats, scribbling notes for the reports they would rush home. Others whispered among themselves, predicting Traoré's words would spark retaliation. But many African leaders sat taller, their faces breaking into the faintest smiles. They had longed for someone to voice what they had felt for years, that Africa was no longer a land to be dictated to, but one that could dictate its own future. Netanyahu straightened his jacket and leaned forward. Strong words from a small nation, he said, his tone dripping with disdain. But words do not win wars. Africa will learn this truth as many before you have. A murmur of discontent rose among the African leaders. The insult had not been aimed at Traoré alone, it had struck at all of them, all their nations, their histories. Eyes turned to the Burkinabe leader, waiting, almost willing him to answer. Traoré did not hesitate. He placed his hands firmly on the table before him, his knuckles pressing against the polished wood. You see a small nation, he replied, his voice measured but resolute. But I see a continent rising. Africa is not measured by your maps or your armies. It is measured by its people, its land, its fire. And that fire cannot be extinguished by arrogance. Gasps and applause erupted simultaneously, the room splitting further. Journalists typed furiously, knowing these lines would make headlines across the globe. What had begun as a diplomatic exchange had transformed into a duel, each word striking harder than weapons. Netanyahu's jaw clenched, but he did not respond. For the first time, silence favored Traoré. Within hours, the confrontation became the story dominating global headlines. Clips of the exchange between Netanyahu and Traoré spread like wildfire across news networks, social media platforms, and international talk shows. The sharp contrast between Netanyahu's warnings and Traoré's unwavering response turned the summit into a symbol of something far larger, the clash between old power and new defiance. In Paris and Washington, commentators replayed the footage with alarm. Some analysts warned that Traoré's boldness could invite retaliation or sanctions. Others, however, praised his courage, calling him the voice of a continent long silenced. Across Africa, the response was electrifying. In Ouagadougou, crowds filled the streets, holding signs that read, "Not while we breathe," and chanting Traoré's name. The people saw in him not just a president but a protector, someone willing to challenge powers that had treated their nations as pawns. Meanwhile, Netanyahu's team scrambled to contain the damage. Leaked reports revealed his advisors urged him to pivot, to frame the confrontation as evidence of Israeli strength and African recklessness. But the narrative had already slipped beyond his control. Traoré's fiery words had seized the world's imagination. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré gathered his cabinet late into the night. The atmosphere was tense but determined. His ministers spoke of the risks, trade restrictions, diplomatic isolation, even covert operations against their young government. Traoré listened carefully, then rose from his chair. "They believe fear will silence us," he said. "But silence is surrender. Africa cannot afford surrender anymore." Those words, spoken in a closed room, soon leaked through allies and became another rallying cry across the continent. For the first time, it was Netanyahu who seemed cornered, not by armies, but by a voice that refused to bow. The fallout from the summit did not stay confined to headlines. In the United Nations, emergency meetings were called as delegates from African nations demanded respect for sovereignty and condemned Netanyahu's remarks as neocolonial arrogance. Ambassadors from Europe sat uneasily, torn between alliances and the undeniable momentum of Africa's unified voice. In Washington, policymakers whispered in corridors, worried that Traoré's defiance might ignite a chain reaction across the continent. Already, leaders from Mali, Niger, and Guinea issued statements backing Burkina Faso, turning a single confrontation into a continental movement. "An injury to one is an injury to all," declared one African president, words that echoed through parliaments from Cape Town to Cairo. Meanwhile, Netanyahu's government doubled down. Officials released statements painting Traoré as reckless, claiming his defiance would destabilize Africa and invite chaos. But the harder they pushed, the more resistance they faced. African youth movements seized on Traoré's words, flooding social media with messages of unity. Hashtags like #NotWhileWeBreathe and #AfricaStandsTall trended worldwide, eclipsing the narrative Netanyahu's camp tried to enforce. Inside Burkina Faso's presidential palace, Traoré watched the global reaction unfold. His advisors cautioned him, "This is dangerous ground, they may try to isolate us further." Yet Traoré's response was steady, "If they fear our voice, then it means we are finally being heard." For the first time in decades, Africa's narrative was no longer being dictated by others, it was being shaped by its own leaders, in its own words. And at the center of this storm stood Ibrahim Traoré, young, unshaken, and unwilling to bend. Behind the loud speeches and global headlines, quieter forces began to stir. Intelligence reports suggested that foreign powers, long invested in Africa's resources, were holding secret meetings. Energy corporations, mining conglomerates, and arms dealers whispered of strategies to contain Traoré's influence. For them, his defiance was not just symbolic, it threatened billions in profit. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu's advisors crafted plans not just for rhetoric but for pressure, economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, even covert operations. "If he refuses to bend, we'll make him break," one senior aide was overheard saying. Yet even as they plotted, a new problem emerged: public opinion. African diasporas in Europe and America rallied behind Traoré, organizing protests outside embassies and demanding an end to neocolonial tactics. At the same time, Burkina Faso's capital, Ouagadougou, became a magnet for attention. Journalists from across the world filled its streets, eager to capture the energy of a nation that dared to stand tall. Every statement from Traoré carried the weight of defiance and hope. When asked if he feared retaliation, he answered simply, "History favors those who refuse to kneel." The tension thickened. Leaders of Mali and Guinea reached out, proposing a joint declaration of sovereignty, while Russia and China quietly offered military and economic support. The confrontation between Netanyahu and Traoré had lit a fuse, and the sparks now threatened to ignite a global standoff. The world's attention shifted to Geneva, where an emergency international summit had been called. Leaders, diplomats, and military strategists gathered under the towering glass dome, but the spotlight was fixed on two men, Benjamin Netanyahu and Ibrahim Traoré. Cameras flashed, and the room buzzed with anticipation. This was no ordinary summit, but the front line of an ideological war. Netanyahu, calm but sharp, leaned into the microphone. "Africa's future depends on order, and order requires our guidance. Without us, chaos is inevitable." His words echoed through the hall, met with nods from some allies, and frowns from others. When it was Traoré's turn, he rose slowly, the military uniform on his shoulders carrying the weight of his nation's struggle. The audience hushed. "Mr. Netanyahu speaks of guidance, but what he means is control," Traoré began. His tone was measured, but each word struck like steel. "Burkina Faso is not chaos. Africa is not chaos. What is chaos, is foreign hands digging into our soil while our children go hungry." The crowd stirred, some applauding, others whispering nervously. Even the moderators struggled to calm the tension. Traoré raised his voice, eyes locked on Netanyahu. "If war is inevitable, then know this: Africa will not fight on its knees. We will fight standing tall, with fire in our hearts and history at our side." The chamber erupted, half in shock, half in admiration. Netanyahu's jaw tightened, but for the first time, he did not reply immediately. The silence between them carried more weight than words, a silence that declared the world was no longer tilted in one direction. The Geneva summit had now turned into a battlefield of rhetoric. The press gallery was filled with reporters typing furiously, their headlines already forming. Netanyahu leaned forward, his voice sharper now, stripped of the earlier calm. "Africa cannot rise without the West. Independence is an illusion if your economies still rely on our systems, your armies still depend on our technologies. If you defy us, you invite destruction." The statement hung like smoke in the air, thick, choking, designed to intimidate. But Traoré did not flinch. Instead, he stepped closer to the podium, his eyes blazing. "Independence is no illusion, Mr. Netanyahu," he said firmly. "It is the blood that runs in our veins, the memory of ancestors who broke their chains, the will of our people who will never kneel again." He raised a hand, pointing to the African delegates seated across the room. "We are no longer pawns in your chess game. You call it destruction, but we call it rebirth. If war is inevitable, then Africa will not only defend itself, it will redefine itself." The audience stirred, whispers turned into thunderous applause from African and allied delegations. Netanyahu's supporters shifted uncomfortably, their confidence shaken. The camera zoomed in, capturing Traoré's unwavering expression. His words weren't just a reply. They were a declaration. For the first time, it was clear, the clash between these two men had grown larger than them. It was no longer about Burkina Faso or Israel, it was about the future balance of global power. And Traoré had just tipped the scales. The hall was vibrating with tension. Netanyahu's jaw clenched as he adjusted his microphone. "You speak of rebirth, Traoré," he said coldly, "but history has proven that when small nations challenge great powers, they vanish. Do not mistake passion for power." The words were meant to crush, but Traoré's face only hardened, his tone sharpened. "History also proves," he shot back, "that empires rise and fall. Rome fell. Colonizers fell. Even the most powerful nations of today will one day fall. The difference, Mr. Netanyahu, is that Africa has learned to endure." He placed his hand firmly on the podium, his voice echoing across the chamber. "You warn us of war, but you forget, war is nothing new to us. We've fought it on our soil, against chains, against guns, against exploitation. And we are still here." The crowd erupted. Delegates from across the global south rose to their feet, some clapping, others shouting words of support in their native tongues. The balance of the room shifted like a tide, washing over Netanyahu's attempts at dominance. Journalists' cameras flashed wildly, capturing the defiance written across Traoré's face. His words weren't just a defense, they were a challenge, a reminder that Africa was no longer the silent participant in history. And in that moment, the summit stopped being a diplomatic gathering. It became a stage where Africa, through Traoré's voice, declared itself unshakable. Netanyahu leaned forward, his voice carrying sharpness meant to reassert control. "Endure all you like, but endurance is not victory. Israel has the means, the alliances, the technology. If Africa resists, it will be left in ruins." His words echoed like a warning shot. But Traoré did not flinch. He straightened his shoulders, his eyes fixed on Netanyahu with unwavering steadiness. "And yet, despite all your technology, despite your weapons, despite your alliances, what has it brought you? Fear. Walls. Enemies multiplying. Victory is not about what you can destroy, Mr. Netanyahu. It's about what you can build." He paused, scanning the room, his voice growing stronger with each word. "We build schools where you drop bombs. We build hope where you sow fear. We build unity where you push division. That is why Africa will outlast threats, outlast intimidation, and outlast every empire that thought it could dictate our future." The chamber erupted once again, this time, louder than before. African delegates raised their fists, Latin American representatives clapped in rhythm, even some European officials shifted uncomfortably, realizing the tide of history was shifting before their eyes. Netanyahu's face hardened, but the silence around him was deafening. His threat had backfired. What was meant to intimidate had instead lit a fire, and Traoré had turned it into a flame for the world to see. At that moment, the summit wasn't just about policies or treaties. It was about dignity. And Traoré had claimed it, not only for Burkina Faso, but for every voice that had been told to stay quiet. The hall fell into an uneasy silence after Traoré's last words, the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from the recognition that something irreversible had been said. Netanyahu adjusted his tie, his jaw tight, his voice low but sharp. "You may win applause here, Traoré, but applause does not protect nations. When the storm comes, will Burkina Faso still stand?" Traoré leaned forward, unshaken. His voice dropped lower, but it carried more weight than thunder. "Storms come and go. Empires rise and fall. But the land, the people, and their will to be free, that remains. If you think you can break us, then step forward. For every ounce of fire you bring, Africa has a flame waiting to answer." The cameras captured every second. The audience erupted into cheers, chants, and standing ovations. Delegates from across the global south shouted his name, others, even those once skeptical, could not hide their respect. The world had just witnessed a smaller nation's leader stare down one of the most powerful figures alive, and walk away stronger. As the summit closed, journalists swarmed Traoré. Headlines were already forming: "Traoré defies Netanyahu. Africa's voice echoes worldwide." The day the global stage shifted. In his final words before leaving the podium, Traoré addressed not Netanyahu, but the watching world. We will not live on our knees. We will not trade freedom for fear. Africa will walk forward, and we will do so with dignity. To those who doubt us, watch us. The chamber shook with the sound of history being written.